We have, of course, come across the Mediterranean now, and I talked the other day about this sea in the center of the world, which is full of history, but is especially full of islands. There's some 12,000 islands in the Mediterranean, and as a sailor, I have been ticking them off and trying to go to one more every voyage, and of course we don't really get to linger like we could if we were in a smaller canoe here. But I'm going to give you a bit of a hop, skip, and a jump across the Mediterranean. And I imagine you've been to some of these places that I'll speak of. And I won't linger on any one as we would wish to do someday. But I'll show you a few islands that perhaps you've never seen before. And of course, there's always another one over the horizon beckoning. And so we've already gone, of course, across from, oh, sorry, there's this funny clicker is a little excited to see us. But we've crossed from Egypt over to Athens through the southern Aegean, and now we have gone around Peloponnese, and we're going to go off the coast of Sicily through the Straits of Messina to Rome, and then through the gap between Corsica and Sardinia, all the way out to Gibraltar, and then off into the larger pond. Now, the Mediterranean is not really a homogeneous sea. It's full of variety in different parts of it. For instance, as far as islands go, there are very few in the eastern Mediterranean. The largest, of course, being Cyprus. But there's nothing like the archipelagos you get in the north coast, Italy and Greece especially. So there's a very few sites offshore if you sail out of Beirut. These are the rocks off of Beirut, though, one of the few pieces of island that are there, but there are no inhabited islands off the coast of Palestine and the Levant. But the great island, of course, is Cyprus. Now, this is the first of the major islands I'll show you, and this, of course, is off the coast of Turkey. It has a very tumultuous history, this particular island. It has been called a bird caught in the mouth of a wolf. Now, that's a Greek expression of how Cyprus has been contested with Turkey for centuries and right down to this day. And it is an island that has a ridge of mountains in the center, a forest you can see here, and then a mixed population which includes majority Greek and then the Turks who have invaded and then set up their own Turkish Cypriot communities, and it has been demarcated under UN supervision for many decades now as sort of a green line that crosses through Nicosia all the way over to Famagusta. And mostly the Greeks are on the south side, the Turks are on the north side, with a couple of British naval installations there to this day. But it has now become more peaceful and more cooperative, particularly as Greece and Turkey have, let's say, assuaged some of their cultural differences over the years. But Cyprus, like some of the major islands, has mountains and forests remnant on the higher slopes of this island. All of the Mediterranean, though, has been much deforested over the centuries. There's less than 10% of the original forests are on the shores and on the islands. And this is largely due to human activity, especially shipbuilding in the old days. They would take all of the woods over the centuries for wooden ships, and now it is slowly growing back, but the climatic changes caused by deforestation all around the Mediterranean basin is one of the legacies of human habitation. Of course, in all of these islands you have great ruins. Here's an Apollo temple in Lemnos in Cyprus. There are the combination, typically like we saw in, some of us went to Corinth yesterday. We saw the Greek and the Roman temples and their remains that stand often near each other, or the Romans took Greek architecture and rebuilt it in their own way. So you can see this in most of these islands. Here's the Kourion Theater in Cyprus overlooking the ocean. Then there was a Venetian control over these islands in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus and Crete were ruled by the Venetians for many centuries and were considered sort of the plantations for the island city of Venice, which did not have great agriculture there in the lagoon and was often in contest with the upland parts of Italy. So the Venetians, the great maritime power at the time, built forts and then had essentially serfs on Cyprus and Crete, which provided grain and wine and supplies for the greater Venetian empire. But Cyprus is a beautiful coastline. Here's a natural arch. And then most famously, it has the Aphrodite Rocks, where the goddess Aphrodite of love was born. And here she is in a statue that's in Syracuse, Sicily, and waking up Adonis, which is how I get awoken every day on the ship, by Aphrodite. But I'm going to go along the coast now. Here's Turkey, which is a variegated coast, but most of the islands in the struggles of the last century have been returned to Greece. And so all of these islands that are here, most famously Rhodes and Lesbos and down to many down in the Deccanese Islands are Greek, as was the mainland before. Of course, the Turkish Ottoman Empire drove Greeks off the mainland and famously took Constantinople, but these islands are still largely Greek, but there are some that are Turkish. Here's a resort on the coast of Turkey, and this is, again, prime, beautiful waters and excellent sailing, and you can go charter a Turkish vessel and go for weeks along this coast. Then you come down to the southern end of the Aegean, and you come to the great island of Crete, or Crete in Greek. It's called Candice in Latin in traditional literature. But this was considered the island truly in the center of the world, south of Greece, west of the Levant, and of course east of the rest of Italy and the other countries. But over the centuries, many cultures came, invaded Crete, conquered it. It was Egyptian, it was Turkish, it was Venetian, and most recently it was invaded during World War II and taken by the Nazis. But now it is a member of the Greek nation, though it is somewhat distinct on its own, has its own flag. But it is a long, stretched out island with a number of headlands and a few small offshore islands. But it has as its center city Heraklion. Now this is a chart drawn by the great Turkish Captain Piri Reis. I've been showing some of his charts over the time, but he had a very careful annotation of all of the islands of the Mediterranean. And most curiously, he drew these mountains and bays, but it's upside down. He was a south-up cartographer. Now here's a later map of Crete or Ghantiya, which shows some of the headlands and harbors. These are very rugged shores. They get lashed by storms, and then also sandstorms come up and blow from North Africa that covers the island in dust during the summer and these hot winds. But it has Venetian castles. If you've been to Heraklion, the main city, it is very well fortified from the Venetian era, including along the main avenues, all these great warehouses that used to store the foodstuffs and the products that would then be taken on the galleys up to Venice. Later, it was taken as part of the Greek nation and rebuilt as a Greek island, which of course it is to this day, with many people moving onto the island. I have a friend who went there and bought a stone house from about 1,000 years ago, and he's been rebuilding it and spends the winters there because the summer is too hot, he says. And Crete, though, is most famous for its truly ancient culture, which was the Minoan culture that goes back about 5,000 years. Now, if you've been to Gnosis, which is the center of the Minoan civilization, you will have gone through the galleries and seen in the museum some of the great artifacts of this ancient culture, most famous for its frescoes of the maidens and activities of this most Mediterranean of people, who were then suddenly put to extinction probably by the eruption of the volcano that destroyed Santorini and put a great tidal wave over Crete, the north coast of Crete. But there are remaining evidence of this very vibrant culture, most famously the Minotaur and the bull dancers. And this is one of the cults of the Mediterranean. It is exhibited by this lapis lazuli bullhead that's in the museum in Heraklion. And this tradition, of course, continues on in various bull festivals around the Mediterranean, most famously the Spanish bullfighting to this day. In Crete, they found this disc in one of the temples There's called the Fiestas Disc, which is the earliest example of imprinting hieroglyphs in culture. Is considered the earliest form of printing, but they've never been able to translate it. This is on a clay disc. On both sides there are these hieroglyphics that have not been translated. They are very ideographic, so they're heads and boats and animals, so that may be just a code for what was going on, but it's never been translated. Some have considered it a fake, but it has yet to be tested to actually date the clay to prove that it really does date from about 3000 BC. Now from Crete we go, as we did on the ship, through the passage past the Cyclades right up to Athens right there. But this is the legendary Aegean Sea with its many, many islands. There's about 7,000 of them all through the Aegean, and Greece by far has the largest number of islands of any of the nations of the Mediterranean. So you can go through all of this area for many lifetimes sailing around and exploring. It's quite tricky if the weather is bad, because the islands loom in the mist and in the storms. Here again is Pyridis's chart of the Aegean, which they called it, of course, the Turkish Sea in the Ottoman sense, but here's going up to the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, and then Istanbul today. But in the area that we travel through, we passed the Dodecanese, and then we went through the Cyclades right up to the Saronic Sea, and then to Athens. And then there's the Sporades further, and then major islands in the North Aegean. And of course, Troy was over right about there. And although the fleet went over to the great battle in our early history. And then down on, we have now come around around the southern edge of the Peloponnese to the Ionian at this point. Now these islands are very famous, and there's many visitors who come out to them. I'm sure you may have gone to Mykonos or Kos or these other islands that are fairly short distance from Athens, and you saw the ferries that go out of Piraeus all day long to give life to the sea transport, so that there are many people living and visiting out on these various islands. Here's one, Andros, one of the larger ones, after which the Andros Islands in the Bahamas is named. Now the Cyclades were also inhabited in very early prehistory, and in archaeology they excavated these very simplistic figurines. Now this was actually in the shop yesterday in Corinth. I took this picture. There is a museum in Athens of just the Cycladian art, which is very pure and plain, and was an influence on modern art to simplify the forms into an elegance that is typical of the prehistoric peoples that lived there. But if you go there now, there are many villages and the inlets and the mountains and storehouses for grain and water, and the whitewashed housing that you're familiar with in the pictures of Greece. Here's another island across on the Turkish shore called Lesbos. And I provided a lot of these pictures just to show you how unusual the islands become, especially if you're a sailor, because you look for this kind of a harbor. You can see how there are two very great and completely sheltered, almost a lake that you can get in a small craft and be completely safe. Of course, this island was famous as the home of the great poet Sappho, and the Lesbonians have complained that their name has been used in other contexts, but it is let's say, a happy island on its own way, but it does have some very high mountains. Now that is the white line is the Turkish border here. But this is a Greek island with its own Olympus and its own few local gods that live on the heights. And then shorefront communities like this that have big sweeping beaches. This is Scala, and here is the center city of Molinos with its great Venetian, I'm sorry, it's not a Venetian fortress, it is a Knights of Templar Hospitalier, the Crusader fortress. Now, a lot of these islands on this coast were held after the Crusades were driven. The Crusaders were driven out of the Palestine in the 1100s by Saladin, and so Rhodes and Lesbos and a few other islands were they call the front line of Christianity in the battles with Islamic forces and the Ottomans finally. And to this day, the fortifications remain on some of these islands. Here's Putmos just to the south with its monastery that's still active on the height of the island. And this again was part of the Crusader fortifications of that era. Now we're coming back to south of Athens. Here is Mykonos, which is a very famous site because of its whitewashed buildings and radiant architecture that includes these great windmills that were for grinding grain. This is iconic of the Greek Isles. Further south, you have very dramatic headlands. As we have passed around, you may have seen the sunset last night. It was very beautiful with these larger islands that are off the Peloponnese. This is Kefalonia, and here's Kythnos, which is right on the southern edge of the headlands of Peloponnese. And this island has what they call in Greek Palaiades, which is a double beach. You can see you can go swimming on one side of the beach, and when the sun goes the other way, you can go to the other side of the beach, which is a sun worshippers' destination. Most famous in this whole group of the Aegean, though, is this great island of Santorini. Maybe some of you have sailed there or are gone to spend a holiday there. This, of course, was the site of the great eruption that destroyed the Minoan culture at about 1000 BC. And this whole island is a crater that collapsed and then is still active and still bubbling right in this center right there. And a ship recently hit and sank there. It's very, very deep on the edges of this crater, but because of the volcanic explosion, may have been Atlantis on it, but now it is, I would say, real estate. It looks like a snow-capped peak, but it's real estate built on hope. And also a lot of visitors go there because it's so dramatic. And it has these great lava beaches, the black sand beaches, which is sort of like Hawaii without the surf. But it's a very dramatic geology right there. Then we've come around from the southern Aegean to past the Peloponnese, this great island. Well, it's not really an island because you have the Isthmus of Corinth right there, and some of us went through the great canal yesterday. So now it is a man-made island because the isthmus has been cut and there are bridges over it. But this has been described as a great hand of an island with many fingers going out into the sea. And then we have gone right around it, right through this strait right here to go off in the Ionian Sea. And this is where the great Peloponnesian Wars happened in history. But most recently it had this terrible fire, 2007, which burnt much of the southern end of the island. Killed 60 people, burnt down 1,500 houses, and a few million olive trees. And this is an example where deforestation that creates almost desertification of a lot of these islands, agriculture, and then matched with extra heat and the terrible winds that'll blow over the Aegean. If there's a fire, it'll burn on and on. And this was a plague all from Spain all the way through Turkey, and especially in this part of Greece, there was a considerable damage done by forest fires. It is possible that it was actually arson, but who knows? These things start and then they're very hard to put out. Now we passed right past this island in the night, Ghantiya, with its monastery on top of an old fortress. And then nearby is this other island, Zakintos, which has this great shelf of a cliff and these lovely little beaches tucked in, so that I like this kind of an island because in the blazing midday you can always go to a beach with a little shade on it, which is very precious in some of these islands that are less flat. And here's another island that's on the Ionian coast of the west coast of Greece, Pasoi. This is a very, again, an iconic kind of an island, a big thumb. And it's similar, there's another island called the Cudgel of Hercules, which is similar to this one, that was supposedly how Hercules broke the land that blocked the sea at Gibraltar. Now I'm going to take you up the coast of the Adriatic. Now here's going up to Montenegro and then the Dalmatian coast, which other than the Aegean has the most islands in the whole Mediterranean. Now there are not that many islands on the east coast of Italy. They're mostly on the west for reasons I don't know why some places have more islands. It's all because they're the mountains that were then flooded, leaving all of these little points of rock and islands all through this area. But this coast, going up from Dubrovnik and up to Croatia, this whole area is quite undeveloped relative to the Greek islands and, of course, the Italian or French coast. But it has some very unusual rocks that are sort of like stepping stones out into the Adriatic Sea. Now, this is an area that many islands are uninhabited because they have no water and they are just a big stone with some lighthouses. Others are more lush. Here's Pag, which is a very big limestone extension out in the bays of the Adriatic. Here's Susak with a lighthouse. Some of these have only resident light keepers or coast guard. They're not residential. Others are much more inhabitable because they'll have either cover, water, or this group of islands called Veli Brijun has a lot of good anchorages. So this is prime cruising territory for sailors. And then as you go up further into the north of the Adriatic, it gets more lush, like here in Croatia. And so it becomes a less harsh environment further there. On the other side of the Great Sea, though, here is Tunis and the coast of Algeria going down to Libya. And there's only very few islands here. You can see them here and then here. This is an island called Gerba, which was famous as a base for the Barbary pirates because it has a lagoon where the galleys could go hide in. And most famously, Charles V of Spain went to teach those Barbary pirates a lesson back in the mid-1500s and had his whole fleet wrecked on the rocks near this island. And some 100 of his galleys were lost. But this was the coast where many battles happened between the northerners and the southerners of the sea. And in the center of this part of the central Mediterranean is, of course, the great island nation of Malta, which is now part of the EU. But this is, like Crete, is the center of this world. So I imagine many of you have been to Malta, which is a very striking island on its own. It's actually three. There's Comino and Gozo on the north, which are less inhabited. And then the main center of Malta, of course, is the great harbor here. And there's some other ones further down. But here again is Pyrides' chart of Malta, which was the site of the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. And of course, the Ottomans sent a great fleet to besiege this, what was considered the redoubt of Christianity in the central Mediterranean. And if Malta fell, then Sicily and Italy would be threatened by the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to give a talk about naval battles another day, but this island was protected by Jean de la Valette, who was one of the Order of St. John, the Knights of Malta, and because they were victorious in the defense of Malta, the harbor was named Valette to this day after the great knight who defended against all odds against the invading Turks. You see some of the fortifications in the part of the harbor. It's a very large harbor and very safe in the center of the Mediterranean, and has an industrial dockage and yacht harbor on the other side, and the great cathedral at the center of the island. Now, this island, like Crete, had a lot of different peoples over many millennia coming to this somewhat barren rock in the center of the sea, but now it is a very cosmopolitan island. If you've been there, it has these grand arcades, and it is, of course, it was a British protectorate for a long time, so they speak a Maltese language. They also speak Italian and also English there. But it's its own unique small nation to itself. The uplands are very dry, and again, in the summer, it's washed over with sand that blows off the Sahara. So again, it's more of a winter holiday place than some don't want to live there in the summer, especially this guy. He got caught there. This is a Maltese elephant. At some point back in many million years ago, this was all a tropical area where African wildlife actually lived on the island of Malta. And here's a skeleton of it in the museum there. But most famous was the very ancient peoples that there's very little known about. They may have been the sea people that the Egyptians wrote about, who built monolithic temples that are on the central island of Malta. It's called Ghantiya. This is one of those archaeological remains you get in the islands of the Mediterranean that have no written history and no evidence of where they came from or what they did other than their great stone remains. So here's the temples complex that is in Malta with these lintel and dolmen kind of construction, and then great walls, including some massive pieces of rock that, like Egypt, we don't know how they could lift and build such structures back before there were any kind of mechanized means, though we weren't there, we don't know. But this is one of the great mysteries of Malta. Who were these people who were building these kind of structures back what's now over 5,000 years ago? Now from Malta, which is down there, it's only 30 nautical miles to the southern tip of Sicily. Now Sicily is another one of these great islands of the Mediterranean. If you've been there, it's its own special place, not quite part of the Italian nation, but really something else on its own, as you certainly know about. And it has a number of other islands around it. These are the Aeolians on the north, and then Calabria here. But above all, it has a lot of good harbors and then a lot of lush inland for agriculture. Now here again is Pieride's description of it. This was the goal of the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to conquer Malta, then Sicily, and then march on Rome and take Rome just like they had taken Constantinople. But the defense of Malta came from Sicily, the relief parties and fleets. So this chart was never put to full use, but to this day now, Sicily is a very I would call it, it's not exactly lush and tropical, but it's a very vibrant place if you've been there. Here's Syracuse, that part of Italy, which was a Greek colony. Most famously, Archimedes lived there. And so in Sicily, you have many good examples of classical Greek architecture when Sicily was called Greater Greece. It was the greatest island of all of the islands that were Greek, and of course then it was taken over by Romans. But it leaves some of the remains of that era to this day. This is somewhat like the Temple to Apollo we saw in Corinth the other day. Later it was taken by Arabs and they built other kinds of remains. This is the Ziza Palace, and you can see the Arabic style windows and structures of that building. Overlooking all of this is Great Mount Etna. And this is one of the most active volcanoes of Europe and a famous site for mariners. You can see it off at sea for miles before you see any land, especially if it is smoking. It's not as active as Stromboli, but it is a great site that lords over the eastern part of Sicily. Here's a painting by Thomas Cole of the scenes of Sicily back in the 1830s. But it is still an active volcano. You can see it here erupting and spewing out over Malta and down, giving a little dust back to North Africa in this view. And of course, Sicily has a lot of cultural traditions. I have no time to go into much of all of the variety of cultures on all these different islands, but here's typical blue ware, and then the classic Sicilian horse-drawn carriage, of which they have a few left for pictures nowadays. And then the famous cuisine. Here's the cannolis. And living in New York, I always felt like I'm living in Ireland and Sicily at the same time. So all of this seems so familiar to me, even though I'm a mere Anglo. But here's one of the festivals in Sicily, which is like Carnival, which happens all through this area. But what I found most curious of this view of the nightlife in Palermo is here's Bill Clinton, I believe he is up there. You know, I thought he was black, but I guess he's also Sicilian. And it says, no, non rosso ma prato, whatever that means. I think it means it wasn't my fault. But anyway, I'll go on to, here's the great Strait of Messina, where we will be sailing through or steaming our way against those. You can see how rough the currents are. Even from outer space, you can see the flow of water through here, which made this the most dangerous of all of the passages in all of the islands, essentially because you have a great landmass on either side, a very narrow constriction. It's only about 5 nautical miles across, and there are headlands and rocks and such. And then there's a little harbor here at Messina with, the Coast Guard, which is watching out for us, especially because we don't want to get into that situation that this guy got in Famously, Odysseus came through, and the sirens were singing to him, and he was tied to the mast, and he put wax in the ears of his sailors so that they wouldn't be drawn onto the rocks. Now, they will be there when we go through, and I don't know if it's going to look quite like that, and I don't believe that's the uniform they will be wearing on the bridge of the great Queen Victoria as we go through, and they're going to have to have a lot of rope to get around the mast up top if they do, but this is, of course, the great legend of this particular passage in the islands, and so Odysseus made it through. Somehow in this portrayal, the sirens have feathers and wings, which I guess is a show of modesty. That's all I can think of. But then when you get through the Strait of Messina, you come up into the Aeolian Islands, they're called, which are in the Tyrrhenian Sea. You have Vulcano, Lipari, there are lots of little ones also, and then most famously Stromboli, the bigger volcano. Here's Aeoli, one of the lower islands, and here's Stromboli, which is the most active volcano in all of the area. And this erupts every 15, 20 minutes, and at night, if you go by in the evening, which we may do, we'll have to check our time, you can see it spewing and a bit of a fireworks. And in Italy, they sell a little popper party toy, which is a Stromboli, that you pull it and it shoots out a little bit of sparkler at you. So this is the most famous island in this part of the Mediterranean. And then as you go up the Italian coast, you have, the Archipelago Tuscana. You can see this is Elba right there, where Napoleon had a vacation home for a while. Of course, he was from Corsica, which is this island, and Sardinia. I imagine some of you have gone on a trip there, and this is like Sicily. It's part of Italy and then France, but it's a whole place unto itself. They have their own local dialects and their own sense of history, and they are uncomfortably part of the larger nations. So look at, first of all, Sardinia. And this, again, has a very high mountain range in the center, a lot of harbors, agriculture, a lot of archaeological remains, and is one of the bigger islands, so that you don't really feel once you get on it that you are necessarily on an island, because unlike a small island where you see the sea in short order, this will take many days to see all of the parts of Sardinia. It has the beaches and the mountains and the highlights of its more Roman style construction. I don't believe Sardinia was ever a Greek island, though these look like Greek Corinthian columns of this particular temple. But it does have some, again, like Malta, ancient remains of a civilization that we don't know who they were or what they were doing, though this has unusual circular foundations for what was obviously a fairly large urban center and a fortress in the center. This is called Sunnaraks, and that's up in the highlands of Sardinia. Now, all of these islands have for centuries been plagued by pirates, and so most of the fortifications are either right on the headlands to prevent invasion, or else the fortresses are up high on the mountains so that they, even if they were invaded, they'd have a redoubt for protection. But I'll speak a bit more about the battles of these islands another day, but you can see how in Sardinia, the mountains are very rough, so there was all of these valley and mountain peoples that lived a existence quite different from the fishermen and the sailors that were down on the shore. Now, just to the north, we have Corsica, or Corse in French, and this was the home of Napoleon, who was often referred to as that arrogant Corsican in his varied career. Again, another view of it by Pieriris. And you can see it has a lot of different harbors and features like a larger island. This was actually where Napoleon was born, Ajaccio, and is now mostly a holiday island for mostly French who will go down there. It is the southernmost department of France, at least other than their Outre-mer. But here's a view of how, again, the mountains are very high and the harbors are broad and very accommodating. Now we're going to go up the coast of Italy. Again, here's Elba right there, and then this is Napoli, and Napoli's right there. But most famously along this coast are the Isle of Capri. Maybe you've been there. It's a great destination where the Roman Emperor Tiberius had his villa, and you can still go up and visit. It's now an art museum. This is a very rugged island, and you can imagine what it was like when you'd go out to these islands before there was mechanical conveyances and you had to either walk up or be carried up to your villas and your heights. And this is typical of this coast of Italy, where this is the Amalfi Coast, where you have to have pretty strong legs to get around town. There are a lot of smaller islands, and so there are hundreds of them all the way up to the French border, but here's just a couple of them. San Pietro, sometimes because of the steepness of the rocks, you also will have a very good and deep harbor. Here's an island off of Napoli, which is Procida, which is part of the fortifications for the old Kingdom of Sicily and Napoli. And those are now, of course, not really used, but the constructions on some of these islands are very dramatic. Now, as we go down the coast towards the French coast in Provence, here are some islands that are off of Marseille and Cannes. This is Frioul, which is the fortifications on a series of islands outside of Marseille. This is the Chateau d'If right here, the fortress where the Count of Monte Cristo, Crispo was imprisoned and then escaped and had his revenge finally in the great novel. But you can see that it's now, the different islands they put a breakwater along to make it a great yacht harbor out there, rather than crowd up the center of the small harbor of Marseille. Another island in this area off of Cannes is Sainte Marguerite. And this was the Fort Royal, which was also a prison. Back in the good old days, if you got a Mediterranean island, you went there in shackles, and it was not exactly a vacation. But this is the site of the story of the man in the iron mask. Here's another island off of Cannes, which is Saint Honorat, which is a Cysterian monastery to this day, and you can go stay in what is an 11th century building with a fortress over on the beach. But there, to this day, they have vineyards and they make their own wine on that island. Now, continuing down the coast, we come to the Balearic off the Spanish coast. Now, you see that there are not that many islands right on the shore, but there's this series of islands right off south of Barcelona, off of the coast, of course, the great Baleares, Mallorca, Minorca, Ibiza, and Formentera. Now, Mallorca, the largest one, again, is a very dramatic island with a number of different harbors. Palma is right there. Oops. Well, there we go. Let's wake my brain up again. And then there's a row of mountains right on the north coast, northwest coast. So it's unusual for an island. It has snow-capped peaks in the winter, and then down on the southern plains it's very hot. And then the city of Palma is a very elegant place if you've ever been there. Again, very busy because it is a great tourist destination these days. And on the coast there are a lot of caves that go back into Neolithic times where people lived on these islands. We don't really understand how so many people would live on islands so far away when we don't understand what kind of boats they might have had, how they would have navigated. But this is one of the great mysteries of the ancient times, is that people seem to have spread far and wide, not just in the Mediterranean, but around the world, with abilities to survive and live on these otherwise very inhospitable places. Here's some of the caves in Mallorca that go back in Neolithic inhabitation. The smaller island of Minorca had fortifications that go back again to Roman era, and then in other centuries, particularly the 1600s, 1700s, this was a British naval base, the center of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. And Mahon, the major capital, was a very well-defended fortress for the Royal Navy in conflict with the Spanish. And then most recently, the wreck of the great ship Sussex was found off of Minorca, and the treasury monies on board that have been disputed between Spain and the UK and the company that have found the wreck to this day. But that's a legacy of Minorca. But again, like Mallorca, it's full of lovely beaches and sights, and a lot of people come to visit there. And again, it has ruins that are prehistoric, but these are thought to be Celtic, similar to what you'll find up in Brittany and then in the Ireland and the British Isles. And this is sort of a Stonehenge that is there on the central island of Minorca, perhaps for religious purposes. Then there's Ibiza to the further south west. This is the last of the islands of the Mediterranean, again fortified, and mostly famous for its nightlife these days. Then on the south side of Ibiza, you have Formentor and the lighthouses that mark the way into the western Mediterranean. And then finally, I'll leave our trip on the last semi-island, which is, of course, the great rock of Gibraltar. Now, it's not technically an island because it has a causeway, but in other ways, culturally and politically, it is certainly an island, and it has its iconic peak. But other than this lighthouse, you may note if you've been there, there is a mosque that has been recently built there as a gift by the Saudi royalty to, let's say, make peace for the area that has been, of course, contested for so many centuries between Europe and the Islamic world, which is just across the gap of Gibraltar. And so if you have, for instance, your yacht or a few of them, you can go around and find your own personal island. I was asked, which island do I really want to have on my own? Well, it's always the next one. And I'm still looking for my ideal island, but there are a number of them that are private. I mean, the larger ones are their own population and their own government, but you can go find your very own island. And so I'm going to put on my Greek auctioneer's hat here for you. And for charity purposes only, I'm going to, oh, gee, there are a lot of bugs in this place. I'm going to auction off a couple of islands here for you. So what do you give me for Argitinios, which is off in the Cyclades? You get your very own lighthouse, monastery. There's a little harbor over there. This is for sale. I think it's only about 10 million euros. Here's San Ferradura, which is off of Italy, which includes swimming pools, again, a little fortress, a few houses, a dock. I believe this is going on for 33 million. Anybody say 34 million euros? And then we got Santo Stefano, again off of Toscana. Now this one is special because it has not only a church, it has a prison. So you can invite all your friends to church and put them in prison or whichever you like. It sort of looks like it's short on a harbor though. And then there's Scorpios. Now this was owned by Aristotle Onassis, and now it's up for auction. So I think this is only about 50 million euros. Do I hear 51 million euros? Right? Oh, going once, well, we go to the charity auction. These will all be on display in a few days. So this is where you could have your very own island and perhaps start your own ancient cultural, archaeological site, things like that, and fully round out your experience in the Mediterranean. Of course, you may have to bring your own wine and food along, but it's a great part of the world with many different places to go. Now, I was asked about Atlantis. What I found is most recently they found this trace of a collapsed island with a rubble trail off of, this is the Canaries. Now, this is out in the Atlantic, but it's thought that perhaps Atlantis happened out there instead of just Santorini or what better known site. So perhaps that is where Atlantis is. We don't know. It's very, very deep, but it's part of that great shelf of the Canary Islands, which spreads out into the central abyss of the Atlantic. That one is not for sale. But there are so many places and so many wonders in this part of the world. So I invite you to come with me on my own sailboat, and we'll go exploring someday. As long as you bring a few million euros with you, I'm sure we'll find something we really like. And I'll leave you with Aphrodite's birthplace as a temptation for our future journeys. Thank you very much.